28 is an ordinance to amend the administrative code to require Board of Supervisors approval of a policy governing the funding, acquisition, and use of certain law enforcement equipment consistent with the criteria set forth in state law and approving the police department's use of equipment policy.
Thank you. Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, President Walton. Colleagues, as all of you are now aware, this year a state law Assembly Bill 481, interestingly enough, authored by our own former Assembly member, now City Attorney David Chu, went into effect, which law requires law enforcement agencies at the local level throughout the state of California to create policies governing their use of military type law enforcement equipment. And the San Francisco Police Department, by and through the mayor's office, introduced legislation to comply with AB 481, which was heard by the Rules Committee, I believe, on a half a dozen occasions, thereabouts. And the original policy evolved over the course of those hearings, and we took public input. It was done, I think, in an extraordinarily transparent fashion. Along the way, as this was our police department and this board's first time out, the original policy, and I'm not saying this in a pejorative way, was less than clear and adequate while put up against the state law. For instance, in this wide range of policies dealing with everything from long-range acoustic devices, now known as LRAD, to the use of less than, quote-unquote, less than lethal weapons, to the Bearcat, which is a form of our armored personnel carrier. The list goes on, the use of robots. In many places, the original draft forwarded by the police department through the mayor's office was not clear about what the authorized uses were as set forth in the state law. In some cases, under the authorized use, it was really stating the purpose. And so through a number of iterations, in an iterative dialogue with police department staff, we got them to actually do what the law intended. Along the way, as we had these open-ended conversations, and as the committee was asking questions, and by way of example, in one of those, the original policy around the use of robots was very open-ended and vague. And I posed the question, and it was really a question by example relative to all of the policies. What uses are prohibited? For instance, could this be used to deploy lethal force? And I am paraphrasing, but the department said, no, that is not what the robots are for. That is not how they work. That would not be an authorized use. I subsequently, based on notes that I had taken from those open-ended interactions, did my best at putting together a red line of those conversations into their policies, which I then gave to the clerk of the committee for all to see, and it became a part of the file and, of course, sent to the police department. The police department subsequently responded to that. And by the way, that document was a compilation of the conversation that we were having. The police department subsequently responded to that with the grid that you see in your board packets that said, we accept this suggestion in whole, we accept it in part, we accept it with modifications, we do not accept these. By the way, if you look at that original document, around many of those things, I have questions in brackets, I have question marks, etc. In one of those responses, in the original one, when around the robot issue, they said, no, that's not what our robots do. We don't deploy them for lethal force. That's not how they work. As a matter of fact, it is the vast majority of the 12 functioning robotic devices that are currently in the possession of the San Francisco Police Department, which, by the way, I went and visited and looked at, are for situational awareness. They are not capable of deploying any kind of device. They are basically little cameras on wheels that can climb stairs and go and see where somebody is in a emergency situation. There are, however, a number of robots that are used by the San Francisco Police Department's bomb squad. Those robots are equipped to be able to pick up an explosive device and remove them from a structure or a place. Those robots could be used, have never been used, and nor has there been a policy up until AB 481 to do the reverse, to deploy an explosive device. After the conversation that we had and after the red line that I sent them, the department thought twice about it, and they came back and said there could be an extraordinary circumstance where in a virtually unimaginable emergency, they might want to deploy lethal force to render, in some horrific situation, somebody from being able to cause further harm. They stated that case to the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee bought it. It has become the subject of local, state, and national press. It speaks to fears about a dystopian, robotic, remote killing future. I understand the concern and fear that can evoke in our society as all things technological and robotic seep into various aspects of our society and culture. I'm open to having a conversation, but I thought it was important to start this conversation by setting the context of what the Rules Committee did. I am delighted actually to have had this very public, iterative, interactive, relatively collaborative conversation over the course of those half a dozen or 7 meetings with the department and the public. And I am also delighted that the only comments we are hearing in around, I think, 13 pieces of policy for a wide range of things, ranging from submachine guns to pepper balls to flashbang grenades, it would appear to me now down to this one issue. So let's talk about it. Let's hear the arguments, and let's see what this board decides. We can amend it in this committee. As a matter of fact, yesterday I had a conversation. I don't know if this will do the trick or not, but I had a conversation with the police department wherein, if you look at authorized uses in all of the sections, it speaks to what level of training officers need to deploy certain types of military technology. It also speaks to authorized uses. It also speaks to authorized personnel. One suggestion relative to this policy is that authorization be limited to a handful of people in the department, unlike some of these other technologies and other policies. And to that end, I have prepared, at least for the purpose of discussion, an amendment to Section 1A5, which is the unmanned, remotely piloted power ground vehicle authorized use, to say that only the chief, assistant chief of operations, or deputy chief of special operations may authorize the use of robots as a deadly force option. So I can hand that out, but that same section can be used to otherwise amend this. If it is substantive, it will either require public comment at a committee of the whole or re-referral. And I know that Assistant Chief Lazar is here and able to answer any questions that we may pose.
And that was a motion, correct?
It is not yet a motion.
Got it. Thank you, Supervisor Peskin. Supervisor Ronan?
Thank you, President Walton and Supervisor Peskin, for all of your work on this. I have to say I'm pretty disappointed with the outcome on this robot piece. It's so sad to me that in 2022 in San Francisco, a place that has been sort of a center of protest historically around the use of militarized weapons, of weapons like drones and robots that are used to kill people, that it's much more difficult when it's a machine and not a human being that has, multi-sensory ability to make judgment calls, to understand the whole situation in front of them, to have situational awareness, that we have seen a history of these militaristic weapons lead to tragedy and destruction all over the world. So I'm kind of shocked that we're here in San Francisco in 2022 having a conversation about arming our police department. A police department, mind you, that still has not finished the 272 reform measures that the federal government suggested that it implement to ensure collaborative and model policing practices in San Francisco. 272 recommendations, which is so enormous, and came after several killings. In fact, the police have killed 58 people since 2000, many of which were under circumstances that brought the community to its heels because of the way in which the most vulnerable members of our community, often homeless people, often people of color, often people suffering from mental illness, were killed. And now there's an idea that we can send a robot in to do this work on behalf of the police. There are so many arguments against this, ranging from you give someone a tool, the tool begs to be used, right? That might be used originally only occasionally, but then over time people get desensitive. Overuse, because when you create that physical distance between the officer and the victim of the use of force, it creates this false distance that makes killing the individual easier. We don't want it to be easy. We don't want to create that distance and that removal from the emotional impact in an individual's life. And this fact that a robot simply will not be able to make these judgment calls in the same way with full situational awareness that a police officer would be able to make that judgment. The list goes on and on. Hacking, there's so many arguments on why would we open this Pandora's box. So I am against this. I don't think we should allow it. I'm actually sad that the dialogue led to this being even contemplated. Right now, no officer walks around with a robot 24 hours a day. So if a situation would call for a robot, there would be plenty of time to consider and use other options with individuals, including de-escalation that we've talked so much about. I don't know that we should, invent scenarios and unlikely scenarios that we can always invent to invoke fear in people that then convince them to give away their civil liberties or to introduce dangerous weapons into society. I just don't understand why we would do this, and I'm against it. I'm voting against this no matter what. However, if the majority of supervisors believe that this is the right way to go, then I would at least beg you to consider, and I have alternative language for you. I won't even vote for the alternative language, but it's better than what's before us. I don't even understand what this language says in the authorized use number 5. Robots will only be used as deadly force option when risk of loss of life to members of the public or officers is imminent and outweighs any other force option available to SFPD. What does that mean? What is I got it.
Okay, I'm sorry.
What does outweighs even mean? Does it mean that they have to at least try to use alternative options before they send in a robot? The language is so vague that I think it's dangerous and would change it. Chief Lazar, if you want to explain what you meant by outweighs, I don't think this language is specific enough for anyone to understand it without explanation. And so I think at minimum, this language must be changed. But again, I think this is incredibly dangerous route to go, and I'm very hopeful that a majority of my colleagues will just vote to ban the use of robots or authorizing the police to use robots to use deadly force upon anyone in San Francisco. Chief Lazar?
Yes,
Through the chair.
good afternoon,
Through the
President
president.
Walton, members of the Board of Supervisors, Assistant Chief David Lazar. So a couple of things I'd like to bring up briefly. One is with regard to the language that Supervisor Ronan used. Let me just paint the picture and give the example of when we would use this in this situation. If you think about Las Vegas, what happened at Mandalay Bay? They had an active shooter. He broke out the window of his hotel room. He started shooting and killing people on the street, families, women, vulnerable, other people attending the concert. He was pinned up into that room, and he was firing and he was killing people. In that situation, we would have, if that happened in San Francisco, it could happen in San Francisco, where you have an active shooter that is shooting people. He's in a building. Maybe he's shooting through walls. He or she is shooting through walls. So people in the apartments are affected. You can't evacuate. He's just killing people. He's shooting. People are pinned down. The police are pinned down. We would then think to ourselves, okay, this is a possible option. These are not autonomous robots. No one's tapping in. These are trained police officers that would utilize a robot that, instead of a police officer or other members of the public being injured or killed by this individual, we would send the robot in and we would use force that way. And we would save lives in doing that.
Could I ask you a question? How was the shooter in Mandalay Bay brought down?
So Mandalay Bay, I don't know the outcome. He was probably shot by police. But I will say this, we could have situations, if you look at what happened in Dallas, Supervisor, in 2016.
But can I ask you, please, I would ask you different. I know I can invent or.
I just want to answer your questions, that's all, and bring clarity.
So I would ask you to answer my questions.
Okay.
So, this all happens quite quickly, right? So would it not delay the situation if there's a mass shooter and there's only a few of these robots and there's only a couple people that can authorize it? Would it not delay to then transport the robot to the scene? And so a fear that I would have is, I understand that it would be that police officers have a job that is potentially dangerous and that it would be incredibly scary to risk one's life to take down a mass shooter. Totally understand. What happened in the school in Texas is an example that it took forever, So by the time, but if they have this option of having a robot go in, would that not then lead to delays which might lead to more killings?
So we're talking about two different things. If we're talking about an active shooter in a school or an active shooter where we have to stop the threat, the officers are going to risk their lives to go in and stop the threat.
But Mandalay Bay was an active shooter. I'm just responding to the hypothetical that you brought up.
Yeah, Mandalay Bay was an active shooter, or someone who's up in a window shooting. We don't necessarily have to go in and put ourselves at risk if we have time to do so. So in other words, let me just be clear. We're talking about using a robot that we've had for 11 years in the San Francisco Police Department. This is not brand new. I think people in the media have reported that we are asking for new technology. We have had this capability and we've had the ability to use this robot for 11 years. And we have it as a tool in the event that we do have time, that we don't have to go in and stop the threat immediately, that we have secured the scene, and we weigh out, do we want to risk lives and the public by getting ourselves exposed to the suspect, or can we send a robot in to deal with it? And we use the robots every single day. I mean, we use them for search warrants, we use them to de-escalate. They're used for all different types of things.
Right,
So,
so
this is nothing new.
So, okay. If you're going to use a hypothetical and then say that would not be the situation where a robot would be used, that's not helpful.
Let's use that hypothetical
To me, that's
then.
a scare tactic, right? So I would ask you to use a hypothetical that would be realistic, that there's not an active shooting taking place. Otherwise, you wouldn't have time to go get the robot to stop the guy. And hopefully hopefully a police officer would stop the active shooter, right? So what is, and again, this language is so vague, outweigh. Can you can you either use a hypothetical or explain to me what would be the thinking where using a robot would outweigh using de-escalation techniques, using a person to go into the situation
Great
and
question.
use all
Yes.
of their
Great question.
their judgment
Yes.
and being able to see 360 degrees. There's nobody in the way that could be a potential unintentional victim. All of these things that a person controlling a robot from a distance might not be able to do.
Okay, great question. So I keep using the Mandalay Bay, but let me just take the Mandalay Bay sniper situation and move it to San Francisco. So you have a person, the shooter is in a building, he's in an apartment building, he's firing on the street. We respond, there's people that have been shot, they've been injured. We have them cornered into a particular location. We feel that we have him cornered there, that for now, other than him shooting at people, people in the building are semi-safe. We try to negotiate, we try to de-escalate, we try to give him a phone, we try to do all these types of things. It's similar to what happened in Dallas, where the suspect asked for a phone after he killed 5 police officers. And the Dallas Police Department knew that if they go try to give him a phone, that he's just going to shoot the 6th officer. They sent a robot in, and the robot detonated an explosive device. So in that situation,
Did they send the robot in with a phone first to see if that was a way to de-escalate? I'm just saying.
It's possible we could send in with a phone, but if it doesn't de-escalate, we still have our tool.
I'm not against robots being used for the purposes that you talk about, bringing in a phone so that another police officer isn't unsafe. De-escalating, doing reconnaissance, like all of, the ways in which you use it every single day. We are specifically talking about what the implications are if we start to depend on robots to kill people that are potentially dangerous instead of human officers who have had training, who don't have distance, who can see 360 degrees and use their life judgment to decide the right move. All of these things that using a robot takes away those important human abilities that only humans have and that officers are trained for. That's what we're talking about, and that's what I think would be a mistake. Really, I'm surprised that this is controversial. I can't imagine really a situation where we couldn't secure a perimeter, where the extra time it would even take to bring a robot, we would want to get people out of the situation so no one was at harmed. And then it would be a matter of waiting someone out and keeping everyone safe with all the other equipment we have. Of course, I don't want any officer to lose their lives, but I think that this is that the scenarios that we're using are hypotheticals to bring up fear, and that don't ultimately really serve to make San Francisco safer. The idea, I had this idea of, God, if there, and as a parent and with a kid, with a 4th grader, I think all the time about school shootings, right? It's the reality that parents have to face in our demented country. And the idea that a robot could go into the school to get the shooter, and the kids that could be around, it opens up a Pandora's box that is terrifying. And I still haven't heard from you how you would define outweighs in a way that makes sense for me. So I'll just end here because every one of my colleagues
I'd love to respond because the things that you've mentioned.
But can I just finish my point?
Yes, of course.
So I just want to end by saying, at the very least, and again, I wouldn't even vote for this, but it's better than this vague outweighs. If a majority of my colleagues think that this is a good idea, which again, I don't, then at least officers, I would put language that you would use this unmanned, remotely piloted, powered ground vehicle, and this is section C of the legislation on page 8, when there is immediate a threat to life, and officers cannot subdue the threat after using alternative force options or de-escalation tactics. So forcing you to at least try to protect people before using this new weapon. I think that is a safer option, but again, I wouldn't vote for that either, because I think we should absolutely not allow robots to use force in San Francisco. And please respond, and then I'm done with my comments and can pass it on to my colleagues.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond by saying some of the examples that you gave is really spot on what we do. Let me just talk about school shootings, what happened, what we've seen across this country. We've had 600 mass shootings this year in the United States, and we have been very fortunate in San Francisco, but we need to be prepared. And so for an active shooter, we're gonna go in, we're gonna stop the threat. There's no robot, we gotta go in now, we gotta stop the threat. And that's what we're trained to do and prepared to do. In circumstances like you've described, we have to have the time to bring the robot in. There has to be a situation in which we've contained a subject in a particular location, we've gotten people to safety, but we know that this end result is gonna end up in a shootout. The person's not gonna be taken alive, maybe they've made threats, they're gonna shoot or kill police officers. We have to have an extra tool to save the lives of officers and the lives of people. And we have to have policy, and we have to have training and procedures and authorization to do that. And the scenario I didn't bring up, the SWAT team talks about often, is the suicide bomber. Like, they have a suicide vest, we don't want to get close to that person. We'd rather send a robot in closer to that person so we don't get detonated when they pull the string. So again, we've had this tool for 11 years. We haven't had to use it, thankfully, and this is a great conversation to have policy and have the board approve what we need to do to have this tool. We don't want to take this tool outside of our toolbox and not have this as an option when we need to. And the last thing I'll say is, the robots you mentioned, Supervisor, about the 272 recommendations and the CRI and all the work we've been doing. The robots on a day-to-day, and I know you're not disputing this, are a de-escalation tool. The example is they go to search warrants, they go up to the residents, they prevent confrontations between the police, they prevent injuries between police and folks that we're dealing with, because the robot has a video and it sees everything and all that. So they've been very useful as tools, as you know, overall. So thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, Supervisor Ronan. Thank you, Chief Lazar. Supervisor Chan.
Thank you, President Walton. Colleagues, I voted in support of this policy at the Rules Committee because I just want to take a quick step back that besides what we're discussing today around the robots, it's really a list of equipments that already in the custody of our police department. It is in their existing inventory. And this policy that is before us today is subjected to the board's approval, is actually in accordance with state law. But I think for me, when I was, as a member of the Rules Committee, when I was considering this policy, that to send it to you for consideration today, and I'm happy that we are having this conversation, that I want to alert you that to address the concerns around use of force, not just for the robots, but just really all across the entire inventory of equipment that currently exist with the SFPD. And as Assistant Chief Lazar has mentioned, particularly for the robot, we had them for 11 years, but so is this whole list of equipments, we have them prior the approval of the state law. So with the approval of the state law, formerly known as AB 481, that's why it's coming to us now as a policy for us to approval. Otherwise, previously, it would not be subject for the board's approval. So with that said, at Rules Committee, I have requested the amendments to the police department, which require the departments to provide an annual report to the board, including the use of equipment, frequency of use, and whether injuries have resulted in each use. This is an annual report that allow us to go over the report so the board can amend the policy and address issues around the use of force on an annual basis based on that report. I think that with this, it's my effort and believe that with the concerted effort between policymakers like ourselves and law enforcement agencies, we can find a balanced approach to public safety. It's the reason why I supported at Rules Committee. But I do understand. I think that I share the sentiment of Supervisor Ronan's and others about the use of force. Frankly, not just with this robots, it's really with the whole list of equipment. And I think that the question and the debate would be, should we look at the history of use, purpose of use, and whether injuries have sustained from these use, and then be able to make amendments on an annual basis accordingly, or do we just deny this altogether? Nonetheless, according to state law, we are required to approve the use of these equipments. So here we are, and it's definitely not an easy discussion. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Chan. Supervisor Preston?
Thank you, President Walton. I honestly can't believe what I'm hearing in these chambers and what's in this proposal. I will associate myself with a lot of Supervisor Ronan's comments. And in some ways, you know, I had concerns when I saw this in the first place. They've only been increased by the dialogue that we've heard here so far. I mean, it is a strange enough way to make policy to try to find one thing that might one day happen and then arm us to assuming there's no other way to deal with it other than a killer robot. But what I'm hearing here, I mean, just what's being invoked is really, I want to talk about this. I mean, I was very surprised to hear the Assistant Chief invoking Mandalay Bay. I mean, we're talking about a sniper in a fully occupied hotel. And the proposal is that the discretion granted here, even with sign-off by the Assistant Chief, would be to put a bomb-bearing robot to blow up that hotel? I mean, I just cannot believe that is seriously being suggested as an example. Or a sniper on an apartment building? We're going to blow up the apartment building with a robot? Or the last one. A suicide bomber. We're going to use a robot with a bomb to subdue a suicide bomber. Like, that's what was just said, in all seriousness. A robot with a bomb to subdue a suicide bomber. What's the threat that the suicide bomber poses? That they might detonate their bomb. So we're going to send a robot with a bomb to detonate a bomb. So let me back up. So I want to thank the Rules Committee, as others have, for the discussion, the consideration of this. And I know there was a lot of input from a lot of stakeholders along the way. There were multiple hearings. There were improvements made to the policy, significant public participation. I mean, it's no secret I have a number of concerns here. I don't think it's just the killer robot issue. I'll get to that in a minute, but I really agree with a lot of the concerns that have been raised by civil rights organizations such as the ACLU, EFF, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, Public Defender's Office, American Friends Service Committee, others that we've heard from. I find it really shocking that just 2 years after our nation collectively recognized police were using unjustified deadly force against people, disproportionately against Black and brown people, that we're having a conversation about letting SFPD adopt a policy, and with approval from this body, that would allow them to use robots to kill. And I just, you know, I think there's a reason why, with all due respect to folks from SFPD, why they think that this kind of policy will fly here in San Francisco. And I think that's because the city continues to write blank checks to the department with very little accountability and very little oversight. And I don't think they feel like they need a very good reason or justification. That's why I started off talking about how thin and really absurd some of these justifications are. They don't feel like they need to give us a real justification because they can use what has worked in the past, which is just to come in here with a bunch of scare tactics and expect rubber stamp approval. So we know that SFPD, and we have talked about this extensively here in these chambers, SFPD is 12 times more likely to use force against black San Franciscans than white San Franciscans. We've talked about the racial disparities, which haven't changed in any appreciable way. Any tools that you give, you got to recognize they will be disproportionately used against black and brown communities. And AB 481 recognized explicitly that military equipment is used disproportionately against communities of color. So I think these kind of tools will only deepen the disparity and the disparities in particular when it comes to inflicting deadly force on communities. So the current, before we even get to back to the killer robot issue, the current version of the policy also fails, and this has been raised in a number of the letters, fails to account for, I believe it's more than half of SFPD's arsenal of assault weapons, leaving those weapons outside the policy despite the fact that they are military weapons. That is concerning in itself. I also have concerns that the approval of this policy, again, regardless of the robot use of deadly force issue, would essentially pre-authorize SFPD should they choose to acquire more of these military weapons, so they would be able to do that without further approval of the board. And I want to say this clearly. I mean, San Francisco is not a war zone. And these kind of devices are simply not needed to protect our city. AB 481 requires the board to approve the policy only if it will, quote, safeguard the public's welfare, safety, civil rights, and civil liberties. Granting the SFPD broad authorization to use and acquire military weapons could absolutely result in SFPD seeking more and more military weapons without prior board approval. Going back to the robots, which of course have been the most contentious and rightfully so, most controversial part of this. Across the Bay, Oakland just rejected a similar proposal to arm robots last month. And they did the right thing over there in Oakland, rejecting this kind of policy. As has been laid out in a number of letters, including the Public Defender's Office letter, other states such as Maine, Virginia, and Oregon have similarly passed laws to ban, in those cases, weaponized drones that have been very controversial in those states. But same principles at issue. So I don't want to mince words on this. In 2018, San Franciscans voted 62-38. Our constituents voted 62-38 to not entrust police with tasers. So if police shouldn't be trusted with tasers, they sure as hell should not be entrusted with killer robots. I think allowing police to arm remote-controlled robots on the streets of San Francisco is dangerous. I think we have plenty of examples. We don't need to go into hypotheticals and theory to look at our history in San Francisco and beyond and look and find questionable and unjustified use of force and improper misuse of bombs and other explosives linked to police. I mean, we have a history in San Francisco of a bomb detonated outside a mayor's house in San Francisco during a well-known and hot dispute with SFPD. We know the story in Philadelphia of the police department dropping bombs on killing 11 people. Like, these are not theoretical hypotheticals, right? You want to look at situations that have occurred. Just last year, LAPD 2021, negligently blowing up half a neighborhood with explosives. So you don't need to grasp at something that hasn't occurred in the last 10 years or, frankly, the last 50 years in San Francisco. Any incident that the department could even come up with to try to justify why you would need this technology here. Like, that doesn't exist, right? But you can look, you can sure as hell find situations in California and beyond of the downsides and the risks and direct victims and lives lost from misuse of bomb technology. And that's without even adding this additional layer that Supervisor Ronen spoke of, which is not even having the officers having to look someone in the eye or be physically present, but doing so through a robot. I've cited some things in the past. I think if you think things are different here and now, I'm sorry to break it to you. I mean, just some of the things we've heard today already from Assistant Chief, but also, just earlier today, San Francisco Police Officers Association takes to social media to attack me in a thread that went so far as to suggest, as the Assistant Chief was suggesting, that we should have used a robot outfitted with a bomb at the fully occupied Mandalay Bay Hotel in Vegas. I mean, these are the same officers and leaders that we're going to give discretion to use a robot to inflict deadly force. Even more concerning, the POA posted photos in the same thread, posted photos of unhoused people suffering from overdoses in the Tenderloin. That's in their thread about why police need to have the power to kill people with their robots today, this morning. So how could we possibly grant this power to police when their first instinct, when this issue comes up before this body, is to conflate people suffering from poverty and substance abuse with the supposedly limited circumstances under which police department would allegedly use killer robots? I mean, that is a pretty concerning frame in which they are viewing the justifications for being able to have robots that inflict deadly force. I think we all understand that police will always want more money, more power, more military equipment. And there will always be some hypothetical situation that someone can come up with to try to justify these things. But the truth is, colleagues, we are talking about a local police department. We are not talking about the National Guard. We are not talking about the U.S. Army. We are not talking about the United States Marines. As much as folks may want to imitate those other entities, this is a local police force here to protect us. This is not the U.S. military that we are arming. And there is serious potential for misuse and abuse of this military-grade technology and zero showing of necessity. And I'll tell you, if you came in here undecided today and thinking, well, maybe there was a situation, I would submit that what we've heard from the Assistant Chief and certainly what the POA has been posting online today should make you think twice about granting this power to them. We have a police force, not an army. Remember that. We have a police force, not an army, and our policy should reflect that. This policy does not reflect that. Lastly, colleagues, while we are debating whether the San Francisco Police Department should be able to spend millions of dollars on military-grade equipment, on training, on maintenance, on personnel hours for robots for use as a deadly weapon, I can't emphasize enough that we need to recognize what an insult this is. What an insult this is to the people of our city who are seriously struggling and need help. So come tell my constituents in the Tenderloin, like those I met with before this board meeting over on Ada Court, who are in the part of the Tenderloin that have no ambassadors whatsoever because supposedly the city can't afford it. Go tell them in the real world why they can't have an ambassador on their corner because of some hypothetical someone dreamed up that frankly makes no sense of why we need to devote the money, resources, and time to a program to have robots that can kill under the purview of the San Francisco Police Department. Like, we have real needs in this city. This is not one of them. And it is insulting to all our residents who have needs in this city that we'd even been thinking about investing one penny of public resources into this kind of equipment or the training needed to operate them or maintain them. So I think this policy will create an unacceptable risk of needless loss of life. I think it would be an absolute waste of resources for the city, and I think it would be an abdication of our role in oversight over the police department and protecting our residents. So I will not be supporting the policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Preston. Supervisor Mandelman.
Thank you, President Walton. I generally strive to find consensus and areas of shared agreement. I want to thank Chair Peskin for his effort to do that with his thoughts about amendments today. But I am in such a different place, I think, from some of my colleagues here on this board in terms of my understanding of the issues that we are discussing and the place of this policy. We are admittedly thinking about far-flung and unlikely hypotheticals, and we are thinking about those far-flung and unlikely hypotheticals because Chair Peskin pressed the police department to do that in the context of a technology that the department has had for more than a decade and has never used in anything close to the ways in which the fine folks at the ACLU, the Lawyers Committee, some of the folks on this board have sprung to high alert over. Chair Peskin asked, is there any way that this could be used to deliver lethal force? And the police department went back and thought about it a little bit and realized, well, actually, if we really think about it, there's shootings, there's hostage takers, there's people who attach weapons to their bodies, explosive devices to their bodies. Maybe there is some circumstance in the future where we would choose or find that the best and safest outcome for our officers and for the public would be to do what was done in Dallas. And so, gee whiz, committee, yeah, maybe there is some circumstance. And then we had the conversation about, well, what kind of guardrails do we put on that? And I think that's a worthwhile thing to do, and I want to thank the department for being willing to engage with the civilian oversight for the department. I think our department is one of the most overseen, regulated police departments probably in the United States of America, and I think that's generally a good thing. But to say that this is some rogue organization terrorizing the neighborhoods of San Francisco that cannot be trusted with technology that they have had for more than a decade is beyond preposterous to me. I think there is some notion in the public, I think it's been a little bit repeated here today, of killer, robo-cops, the human decision-making about what to do in a difficult situation would somehow be handed over to artificial intelligence, which would be making decisions about what to do. That is not what we are talking about. For me personally, the response to this policy is troubling because I rely on the ACLU. I rely on the Lawyers Committee. I rely on our public defender to honestly engage with the policy questions in front of us and give us good advice. I opposed Proposition H in 2018 because I thought it was overreach by the POA. I thought they were going too far. But some of the rhetoric that has been used about this policy and that has generated this debate here leads me to feel like I'm not sure these organizations are trustworthy folks for me to rely on as I think about criminal justice policy and the path that San Francisco should be taking. It starts feeling like they're just anti-police. And that's not where I am. It's not where most of my constituents are. I don't think it's where most of our constituents are. I think we want a police department that is welcomed in every neighborhood, that is seen as an ally to people who want peace on the streets and is going to respond to the public safety challenges. I think we want a reformed department that reflects the diversity of our city, but I don't think we're anti-police. And the rhetoric that starts bleeding into that is problematic for me. And I think, other folks have talked about the larger questions raised by this policy. I think there's larger questions raised when progressives and progressive policies start looking to the public like they are anti-police. I think that is bad for progressives. I think it's bad for this Board of Supervisors. I think it's bad for Democrats nationally. I've said that in other hearings on similar topics, but it is very concerning to me. I suppose that if votes are going to be moved and we could get to a consensus behind Chair Peskin's proposed amendment, and we could get to an 11-0 vote, and the department were all right with having authorization limited in that way, maybe I could support that amendment, but I'm not planning on supporting any other amendments, and I'll be supporting the policy that has been considered at length by the Rules Committee.
Thank you, President Walton. And I just wanted to start by thanking SFPD for all of their work on developing this use of equipment policy, and to the Rules Committee for all of the many hearings and deliberation you had over this, all in compliance with AB 481, which is a really important state law and framework now that adds accountability and transparency to law enforcement in our city and throughout the state. And I appreciate all the work that's gone on and supportive of the overall use of equipment policy, especially with all the with the deliberations with the Rules Committee and the clarifications and strengthening that happened there. But I do appreciate this this opportunity today for us to really speak to mostly to the specific issue of the potential use of deadly force, by robots, law enforcement in San Francisco, and that we really have this opportunity to deliberate on what I think is an ethical question that absolutely should disturb us. And San Franciscans certainly want to feel safe and be safe, and to the extent that that's a motivation here, I'm sympathetic. I supported access to surveillance cameras as a tool because I think it can make us safer, even with civil liberties trade-offs. But like Supervisors Ronan and Preston, I simply do not think arming robots and giving them license to kill will make us safer. I do not think removing the immediacy and humanity of taking a life and putting it behind a remote control is a reasonable step for a municipal police force. And if there were instances in the recent past, real instances, especially here in San Francisco or the area where this kind of technology was absolutely necessary, I would entertain that. But in the balance between safety and civil liberties concerns here, I do not see a real safety benefit that justifies that trade-off. And again, as Supervisor Preston noted, it's also amazing to me that to think that back at the commitments we all made in the wake of the George Floyd's murder by police, murders that happened here too, all of us talked about the need for reform and to hold police more accountable, not less, and to create systems that were less violent, not more. So yes, public safety concerns have changed in the past 2 years, but I do not think the world is so different now from 2 years ago that we can justify this policy. And I do not think robots with lethal force will stop Asian hate or improve the ludicrously low rate of solving crimes or stop smash and grab or retail theft. And I do think they could further erode trust between SFPD and the communities they serve. So again, I appreciate all the work that's been done by the department and the Rules Committee on this, but I don't think we can justify this policy authorizing robots to use deadly force, and I cannot support this ordinance as written.
Thank you, Supervisor Morris. Supervisor Dorsey?
Thank you, President Walton. I think this in some ways is in the category of no good deed goes unpunished. And I want to give kudos to my colleague, Supervisor Peskin, for, I think, going above and beyond and really responding to what AB 481 is requiring us to do by being more transparent, more forthcoming, more detailed. And I think it ended up with a better policy of what we should be doing. But the reality is, I am not aware of any restriction on the use of robotic implements to deploy deadly force by any of the 509 police departments in California. The uses of force are governed by guardrails that are in the Fourth Amendment and in case law around that in the California Penal Code. In Department General Orders, there's a lot of restrictions on uses of force. And when we get into these kinds of debates, it's not one side or the other using hypotheticals. It tends to be a battle of different hypotheticals. But I don't think the reality is not that San Francisco is pioneering a robotic use of force that doesn't exist right now. To my knowledge, with relatively few exceptions, it exists everywhere in California. And we will know as more cities comply with AB 481. Hopefully they will follow San Francisco's lead and be more transparent rather than less transparent about it. I think it's important that we have guardrails on this. And I don't disagree that with some of the civil libertarians, even though in public policy realms I might, but in general terms, I think there should be guardrails on the use of robotic technologies and surveillance technologies, and I'm all for that. But I will tell you, as an elected official in San Francisco, I'm not comfortable making my city a softer target relative to other targets. I don't want San Francisco to pioneer a restriction on the deadly force used by a robotic implement that is unique or at least rare among cities in the United States or in cities in California. At the end of the day, San Francisco is a major American city. We are a top destination for tourists. We are a top destination for conventions. This is a cornerstone of our economy. I want to make sure that we have state-of-the-art equipment. And God forbid, if we are ever in a situation where we have a terrorist attack or a mass shooting event, that we are not depriving ourselves of access to something that will protect public safety. So yeah, I think that there is going to be a lot of hypotheticals about fear-mongering, but let's be honest, that's on both sides of this debate. I am not prepared to be the first of 509 police departments in California to restrict this kind of technology. I'm proud that we are the first city to spell it out in detail, and I think that's kudos to our colleague, Supervisor Peskin. I'm certainly willing to support the amendment to make sure that to put additional guardrails on it locally because I think that's a thoughtful approach that makes sure that this is not something that is used willy-nilly and that we're not pioneering some kind of, the nightmare scenario that I don't think was realistically being brought up in this about robocops or anything else. But yeah, there are circumstances where the use of a robotic implement might be used to deploy deadly force in a way that would save lives and accomplish what a police department is supposed to accomplish in a major American city. It terrifies me that it only takes one individual, one person who, with the evil in his heart, or a terrorist, to hear that San Francisco is unique or rare among major cities of what we're going to deny to our law enforcement agencies. So I will be supporting this amendment, or I will be supporting this, and I would also support the amendment if that is proposed.
Thank you, Supervisor Dorsey. Supervisor Stephanie?
Thank you, President Walton. I do have a question for Assistant Chief Lazar, if that's appropriate.
Definitely.
And through the President to Assistant Chief Lazar, I was confused a little bit about your prior conversation and use of force in this new policy around robotic devices. Can you please explain Is this a new policy? Is the use of force? Can you just go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Our use of force policy is the very same. There is no change with regard to this additional technology. We have a general order that was just passed by the Police Commission that's been revised. It takes effect December 8th. That policy is still in effect no matter what we do, whether we use pepper spray or a firearm or a baton or any tool that we have. We have to follow our policies with regard to use of force. So that does not change. And as a matter of fact, speaking of the Department of Justice Collaborative Review and the reform and the 272 recommendations, you know, our policy of use of force has dramatically reduced the reportable use of force. We have thankfully had less officer-involved shootings than we did before we started all of our reform effort. So we're headed in the right direction.
Thank you for that. And just a lot of things have been said. Has anything come up that you would like to address? So I want to make sure we talk about everything.
Yeah, I thank you. Supervisor Mendelman and Supervisor Dorsey have really just articulated it much better than me in terms of where we are exactly. Where we're at is a tool that we've had for 11 years. We have thoughtful police leadership that think through every situation and make determinations as to what the best option is. That's why we have had so many things happen in our city in the last 11 years, and we've never used this technology or this tool to do the things that we're describing. Supervisor Mendelman pointed out that with this assembly bill, we do have to articulate why we have this. And it's my belief, having been in this profession for 31 years, that there may be a time that comes that we need to deploy something like this, and it will save a life. And to Supervisor Dorsey, to your point, we're not the only agency. The country today thinks San Francisco is the only agency, and this is something we're asking for. We've had it, and other agencies in the Bay Area have it, and they use it, and we'll use it for the same thing that we'll use it for. The difference between some other agencies and us is, to your point, we're a world-class city, a world-class destination. Prior to the pandemic, we saw 25 million people, and we still are a target for many of the reasons that we discussed today. We have to be prepared, and our officers do a great job doing that. Thank you.
I just wanted to make a few points. You know, right before this meeting, I got a text from my son, who's a 17-year-old senior, and he said, "So what the heck are killer robots, and are the supervisors voting on it?" And what has really bothered me about this conversation, which of course should be one we take very seriously, obviously with sensitive issues that we must regard, is the narrative around what's truly going on here. And if I didn't know any better, you know, you would think SFPD just woke up one day and thought it would be really cool to go out and get some killer robots and go terrorize the community. And that's not at all what's happening here. The rhetoric surrounding this conversation, in my opinion, has been nothing short of dishonest, disingenuous, and absolutely lacking in context and details. You know, I read everything that's come through. I saw the public defender's letter. He said the SFPD is fear-mongering and writing their own rules, and which I took issue with, because they are literally complying with a rule, AB 481, and have been in front of the actual rules committee 6 times on this. And I really want to thank Supervisor Peskin and the members of the Rule Committee, Supervisor Mandelman and Supervisor Chan, for really digging into this and coming up with something that they felt comfortable with so that they could forward on to the board for our vote. I feel like they've done a lot of work, and I'm very appreciative for pushing the envelope and going through all the drafts. I mean, they're not writing their own rules when you look at the packet. You know, I just think, of course, there's reasons to fear police officers in situations that have come up for many people, and I do not want to downplay that at all. But the false narrative around SFPD's intention to both possess and use this equipment is just wrong, in my opinion. I feel like people have it backwards, that this equipment is actually there to save lives. And the lack of interest in the details of this policy before it started going out in the Twitter world, was alarming to me, because you get text messages like this from a 17-year-old, like, Mom, what are killer robots? What are the police doing? Why are they using killer robots? I mean, come on. It's fear-mongering against the police. You've had this equipment for 11 years. You've never used it for deadly force. You went back after Supervisor rightly pressed you and said, could it maybe be used? And you knew the Dallas case, so you said, yeah, maybe. But you use it to view scenes, and you have never used it for deadly force. And I thank you for at least coming to us and saying, well, maybe it could be in an extreme circumstance when many lives are in danger. And I'm sorry, but have you seen what's happening in this country? That is not an unlikely scenario. To say we're allowing SFPD or giving them the ability to kill community members remotely and without any rules and no accountability is just wrong. We are talking about the extreme cases. And like I said, you haven't used it in 11 years. And the fact that we even have to bring up Las Vegas, a psycho man in a hotel room with military-grade weapons, thousands of rounds of ammunition, killing 61 people at a country concert. The fact that we can even talk about that normally and just like it's nothing is shocking to me. And a lot of the buzzwords around here, and the fact sheet, the details, the use of force is why I asked you about the use of force. Nothing changes. State law needs to be followed. Our general orders need to be followed. Accountability is there. Nothing changes on that front. And there's been buzzwords out there, I think, again, to create fear and misinformation of the militarization of the police force. And again, no context as to why police departments have had to invest in certain types of weapons. Is because of the militarization of our citizenry over the last 20 years. In 1994, we had an assault weapons ban, and that was because, thank you, Senator Feinstein, following several high-profile mass shootings and attacks on law enforcement and our citizens involving military-style assault weapons, Congress enacted the federal assault weapons ban, and unfortunately, that expired in 2004 without any consideration or action by Congress, despite the pleas of law enforcement officials across the country. I remember them pleading, please do not let this happen. Why? Go read the paper. Go watch the news. You'll know why. The absolute, in this last 20 years, since the assault weapons ban went away, the militarization of our society exploded. When it expired, military-style weapons flooded the market. Not only federal laws, but laws in the majority of states, we're lucky to live in California, were relaxed to placate the greedy gun lobby, and police departments were finding themselves outgunned. And that is not some made-up thing. That actually happened. Today, our nation's police forces find themselves increasingly outgunned by criminals armed with sophisticated firearms and detachable capacity ammunition magazines. Magazines holding more than 10 rounds used to be prohibited under that federal ban. Not so much anymore. When I was involved with the gun violence prevention community at this time, because I've been working on this issue for 30 years, law enforcement was right by our side saying, please don't let this happen. They said, what is happening now, the fact that we're even talking about having a robot, maybe having to disarm someone who's about ready to kill 61 people at a country concert, the fact that we're even talking about that in our country is insane. But back then, the law enforcement officials were saying to everybody, there's no reason that a peaceful society based on the rule of law needs its citizenry armed with 30-round ammunition magazines. We're literally outgunned. You're talking about the kind of firepower that can go through vehicles, through vests, and that can literally go through a house. After one of his officers was ambushed by a teenager wielding a semi-automatic AR-15 and fired at him 26 times, the Oklahoma police chief said there are just more and more assault rifles out there, and it's becoming a bigger threat to law enforcement each day. They are outgunned. And it's true. We know that we've lost some of our very own officers to those in possession of military weapons. Officer James Gelf succumbed to gunshot wounds sustained when he was shot by a carjacking suspect. He was taken out with someone with a semi-automatic rifle as the officer approached his vehicle. Officer Gelf emptied his service weapon, which was not a military-style rifle or a gun of any kind, at the suspect and was reloading when he was shot and killed, because we know a service weapon of a police officer versus a semi-automatic rifle doesn't give the police officer the greatest odds. Also, we know that Officer Espinoza, suspect opened fire with an AK-47 and then fled. He was struck multiple times and killed. So these military-style weapons are on our streets. And so when people talk about the militarization of our police force without context as to what's happening around us, is really unfair. It's as if the police force just decided it would be really fun to act like they're in the military and get all these weapons. That's not it. You're responding to what's going on in our country, the sad situation of the gun violence epidemic in our country. That's what you have to respond to. One of the last things I want to read was from a police officer in July of 2009, after a birthday party shootout involving a semi-automatic AK-47 in which 2 young people were killed and 10 wounded. The Miami police chief told ABC News, "For me, it's a no-brainer. These are weapons of war. Under no circumstance do they belong in the cities of America. Now, police officers are facing, and citizens are facing, these assault weapons. We don't stop it now. What's it going to look like 10 years from now? Rambo becomes reality." Well, we are well over 10 years from now, 13 years from now. And look, that's the conversation we ought to be having. That is our dystopic sci-fi reality. That an 18-year-old can purchase a weapon of war with a credit card in Texas and walk into an elementary school and eviscerate children with that weaponry. That is the problem. We have had over 600 mass shootings in America this year alone. It seems like our country is under constant attack. Communities ravaged by gun mass shootings barely have time to start grieving before the next tragedy takes place. We were just mourning the 5 people that were killed at the LGBTQ club in Colorado Springs, Colorado. A few days later, we hear about the gunman who killed 6 people and injured 5 more in a mass shooting at Walmart in Virginia. And that was only the second shooting in Virginia in only a week, following 3 football players that were killed on a bus at the university in Charlottesville. Earlier this month, a shooter entered Central Visual and Performing Arts High School in St. Louis, Missouri, with the intent to kill as many as possible. It's a teenager. He was armed with an assault rifle, 600 rounds of ammunition, and high-capacity magazines, the choice for mass shooters time and time again. The gunman killed a student and a teacher before his gun jammed, perhaps the one thing that saved the other countless lives. Unfortunately, we know exactly the kind of carnage that could have been possible because we see it over and over and over again. 22 killed in Uvalde, 7 killed in Highland Park. Well, at a parade, for God's sakes. Well, 48 others were injured. 10 killed in Buffalo while grocery shopping. 17 killed in Parkland while being in high school, while 17 more were injured. 61, we mentioned this, killed in Las Vegas. 26 in Sandy Hook. I could sit here for the next hour and go over mass shooting after mass shooting after mass shooting because there's military-style weapons all over this country. Those are only some of the tragedies that our nation has witnessed in the past few years. Each and every single life that has been stolen should have been prevented. Yet weapons of war, military weapons designed for mass destruction remain on our streets. So here is the context of what is going on here for me as to why police departments have to even think about military-style weapons, why we even have to sit here and discuss robots. It's crazy. There is one link between all of the deadliest mass shootings in the U.S. The gunman used a military-style weapon, an AR-15. Uvalde, Highland Park, Buffalo, Odessa, Dayton, Aurora, Parkland, Poway, Orlando, Las Vegas, Pittsburgh, Newtown, Charleston. These are the last resort measures that can only be used in the most extreme circumstances to save lives, when all other measures are not viable. It's about officer safety, it's about the safety of all our communities, and the safety of everyone who visits the city and county of San Francisco on any given day. And so while I understand the conflict, because we have that conflict around police in San Francisco, I also understand the context, and I also understand the details. I will be voting in support of this measure today in a continued effort to keep our city safe. And I really want to thank you, Assistant Chief Lazar, and again, I want to thank Supervisor Peskin for really drilling down on a policy that holds the police department accountable, that shows what would happen in the worst case scenario. God forbid we ever get there. And thank you for, in the last 11 years, having restraint. And thank God we've never had to use this type of weaponry. But you know what? As Supervisor Dorsey said, I'm really glad we have it. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor
Thank you.
Stephanie. Supervisor Safai.
Thank you, President Walton. Just really wanted to thank everyone for I think it was a very important conversation today. Hearing people express their concerns from all angles. It's unfortunate that we have to have this conversation at all, given the realities of where we are in the country today. I want to thank Assistant Chief Lazar for providing context, understanding that we've had this authority for 11 years, but also knowing that there's times when we don't think the worst can happen, or that the unusual can happen, or the out of the ordinary circumstance can present itself, and sometimes things can go wrong. And so that means on both sides, you know, having this power is an extraordinary use of power. And I heard the Assistant Chief say they've never had to use this power. They've never had to use this option. But if a situation presented itself in the most unusual circumstance or extreme circumstance, it's important to have that as an option. Unfortunately, not fortunately, but really unfortunately, that we would even have to experience something like that. And we've been given a lot of examples around the country where I don't know if necessarily this would have helped, but I know that there are examples where it has helped, and that's important. Also want to thank Supervisor Peskin for always being very thoughtful and digging in deep on policies. And so I think it is important to have this detailed conversation and think about putting guardrails in to control for things that could go wrong, and there could be abuses. So I appreciate that conversation. I will be supporting this today, but certainly I'm open to putting guardrails in place to ensure that there wouldn't be any abuse in the most worst or extreme circumstance. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Safai. Supervisor Melgar.
Thank you, President Walton. I'm not going to take up a whole lot of time here. I will just say that, you know, the hyperbole and the over-the-top language that's been used around this discussion is disappointing to me, because I think that we're living in political times where that has just gotten us as a country to a place where we just can't hear each other, and buzzwords get thrown around. I do think that in San Francisco, we are in a place where people are looking at us, wanting to harm us. We had, you know, armed people stage a coup or attempt a coup in our nation's capital, and all kinds of hate thrown our way and to our elected officials from people all over the country because of who we are. So, you know, I am under no illusion that we will never, you know, be able to use this. I know for a fact that the POA had nothing to do with writing this, nor do I think that, you know, any resources were taken away from ambassadors and the Tenderloin to fund something that we bought 11 years ago. So just, you know, to be, you know, real about what we're doing, I did not watch all 6 times that this was in front of the Rules Committee, but I did watch the last 2. And I know how hard the committee members, particularly Supervisor Chan and Supervisor Peskin pushed back on the department. So I want to thank you very much about your thoughtfulness and your hard work. And I will, after my conversation with Supervisor Peskin this morning, be supporting the amendments if he makes them. I think that they are thoughtful, because I do agree with Supervisor Ronan that this language about outweighs any other force option available to SFPD could be tighter. And I do believe that the amendments as were read to me by Supervisor Peskin will do that. So I will support that. And if amended, I will support this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Melgar. And before I get to Supervisor Peskin and Ronan, I just wanted to make a couple of brief comments. And I know most of this will probably fall on deaf ears because for some reason we forgot what happened in 2020, and we think that giving police officers more tools and more weapons is going to make people more safe. And I haven't seen any evidence of that, but I'll say it anyway. And I do want to thank Supervisor Peskin and the Rules Committee for all the thought that has gone to this, because outside of buzzwords, outside of the way things get framed, I know every last one of us here take this conversation seriously, and we're able to see past the minutia that the media portrays or that people put out there. But I was really trying to listen to a lot of the scenarios objectively, try to listen to Chief Lazar objectively, and just trying to see if there even is a scenario that makes sense. And I will say that everything that was said in this hearing, I don't see how a robot being armed with certain weaponry would save lives. In fact, the scenarios that were presented here seemingly, to me, would create a situation where a robot would actually harm innocent bystanders. And as a grandparent, as a parent, the last thing I want is a robot responding into a mass shooting in my children's school or my grandchildren's school. There's no way, shape, form, or fashion that I would be excited with that or comfortable with that. But I want to just talk about bigger context when we look at the 272 recommendations from the Department of Justice. And we know that most law enforcement weapons are used against people of color. And as we had this conversation, I'm really just stunned that we're here talking about this, because we can't keep saying we want to achieve equity and reform. We want to preserve life and end the attacks on people of color. We want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to protect everybody and keep people safe without people being abused by the system. We can't say that that's something that we promote and we support and that we're about, but continue to push and promote policies that do more harm than good to people of color. We are here to approve a policy on how a police department will be able to utilize certain weaponry. And that is something that the state wants us to do as a city. But most certainly, it does not have to include weaponizing robots to use of force while we approve a protocol for approval of certain weapons or tools used by the police department. And it seems like every week we're being asked to either violate more civil liberties of folks here in this city on behalf of the police department, or pass policies that increase opportunities for negative interaction with people of color in the police department, when we were told by the Department of Justice, when we were not recommended, but actually mandated as a city to make certain changes towards reform. And this may seem minuscule when you say, well, it's just, this is a robot. Maybe these scenarios never happened. We haven't used them before. This is not something that our police department has ever done. And so why not just approve this one thing? We continuously are being asked to do things in the name of increasing weaponry and opportunities for negative interaction between police department and people of color. This is just one of those things. And I have to disagree when it was said that not supporting something like this makes you anti-police. It does not make you anti-police. It does make you, in my opinion, pro-people of color and pro-supporting ways to alleviate tension and do everything we can to de-escalate any types of violence as we work to keep everyone safe here in San Francisco. But I haven't been given a scenario where this would even be utilized or make sense to saving lives. And most certainly, from what I've heard on this floor, quite frankly, it seems like it would do more harm than good from the scenarios that were presented today. I'm pretty sure if we all walked out and were given a homework assignment to come up with one or two scenarios where it would make sense, we probably could. But we're in a position as a Board of Supervisors to make sure that all city departments, including our police department, comes before us to get certain items approved that they want to use here on our residents here in San Francisco. And we have to, of course, be mindful that that's important and make sure that we do that. But that's separate from having to include the use of deadly force by robots. We don't have to include that in this policy approval. And so I would not be supporting the entire policy because of that caveat. But I do appreciate everyone for the dialogue today. There are lots of points of views here at this board and here within the city now in terms of how we keep people safe, but I don't think continuing to weaponize our police department is the right direction to go in. Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, President Walton and colleagues. I will concur with President Walton that I have appreciated the various viewpoints that I've heard from all of you colleagues today. And while I do associate myself with the comments of those members and the department wherein there could be truly extraordinary circumstances where that are crazy and deadly enough where this is warranted, I also concur that the words matter, and some of the comments that I have heard here today suggest to me that we could make those words better. And while that certainly is not going to satisfy all of us and get us to a unanimous vote, I think that, and there's been various iterations of this over the various meetings in the back and forth, I think that and we're not going to figure this out right here, right now, but I think that very clearly setting forth the highest barriers beyond the initial language that I suggested at the beginning of this meeting relative to authorization by the chief or assistant chief, but getting to some of the language that I've heard Supervisor Ronan and others discuss around this truly being a last resort use, and that de-escalation and other use of force have been, shown to be futile, or the situation rises to a level where they cannot be enacted. I think those words matter. To that end, and at the risk of incurring the wrath of my fellow Rules Committee members, I would suggest, if you all are willing, that we approve the policy today, absent the last sentence in the first paragraph of section 1A5, and refer that particular sentence back to committee with a representation by the chair, namely me, that we will hone that in conjunction with the public and the department to get at that truly very narrowly crafted high barrier that I think people deserve and that certain members of this body have articulated, and approve the rest of the policy with whatever vote would be forthcoming. So I'm willing to subject myself. I know that that is going to make Supervisor Mandelman and Supervisor Chan quite happy, he said sarcastically. So that's a proposal. I'm not making a motion yet, but that's the motion I would make.
Supervisor Peskin, can you read what section 185 states?
Yes, it states, robots will only be used as a deadly force option when risk of loss of life to members of the public or officers is imminent and outweighs any other force option available to SFPD. Supervisor Melgar also took issue with the word outweighs. I think that words matter, and we can make those words better and clearer and more narrowly crafted, which I think will satisfy at least some of the members who've spoken to that. I share those concerns, but that is responsive to your question, Mr. President.
Thank you, Supervisor Peskin. Supervisor Mandelman.
Well, I might be able to be persuaded, but my inclination is we have heard this 6 times in the Rules Committee. Our police department is busy with any number of projects that we would like them to be making progress on. The amendment, which I expressed tepid support for, and only if it would get us to a majority, appears like it would at least pick up 1 additional supporter for this. I would say that we ought to take the amendment that Chair Peskin proposed at the start of this, rely on the judgment of some of the folks higher up in the police department to actually give effect to the intention of that language, which I think is pretty clear and reasonable people can interpret in an appropriate way, and get this behind us. So I don't really want to send this back to committee.
Thank you, Supervisor Mandelman. Supervisor Chan.
Thank you, President Walton. I'm sorry to disappoint Supervisor Mandelman. I am more in a school of I'm more than willing to entertain the language and to be as precise as possible. I want to validate the concerns of our colleagues and really the general public, and I still have great respect for our public defender and ACLU. I think that it is a worthwhile attempt, even though that does not necessarily means that we will be successful at it. I think it's always worthwhile. It's truly life and death situation, or the language itself and the words itself could impact the life and death situation. I much rather having a more thought out language. If this is the concern. Again, I think that ultimately it may not mean that we get unanimous support, but at least we should give it a try. So I'm happy to entertain to send it back to committee specifically for the section related to the robot use. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Chan. Supervisor Safai.
Yeah, I just have a point of clarification for our city attorney. Would any of these amendments be substantive? And there are 2 readings on this ordinance change, is that correct?
Deputy City Attorney Ann Pearson, yes, there are 2 readings on the ordinance. And to eliminate that sentence, as Supervisor Peskin suggested, would not be substantive, nor would it be substantive to change the authorizations that are required for the use of a robot as a kind of force.
So it just seems to me, colleagues, just based on what I've heard, I'm not necessarily sure that it needs to go back to a committee. It seems as though, Supervisor Peskin is very often the one that says, between now and the next vote, I'll come back with the language that's necessary. It seems as though, not to minimize the situation in any way, but it seems as though there's a starting draft of what you've proposed. We could adopt that today, and in the meantime work on stronger language that we could then come back next week and have that be. I don't necessarily think we benefit more from having a longer drawn out conversation, particularly given the debate and conversation that's already happened in committee. That's just my 2 cents. I think it might be worthwhile to make that amendment. I think that there seems to be more consensus from even the people that are supportive of this, that there needs to be the guardrails put in place. I think your first attempt is a good first step, and we have time to have that conversation, which would allow us 2 votes before the break. That's just my opinion. Anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Safai. Supervisor Ronan?
Yes, so there are 2 amendments, as I understand it. The amendment I proposed has been approved as to form by the City Attorney's Office. I'm not sure if that's the case with Supervisor Peskin's amendment. It has. So we have 2 amendments that have been approved as to form by the City Attorney's Office. The amendment I would like to suggest, so it's that same part of the law that Supervisor Peskin just read. It's section 5. It's the second sentence of authorized use that says robots will only be used as a deadly force option when risk of loss of life to members of the public or officers is imminent and outweighs any other force options available. I would replace that sentence, outweighs any other force option available to SFPD, and replace that with officers cannot subdue the threat after using alternative force options or de-escalation tactics. So basically what that means, and if we need time to print it out to share with people, sure,
And
happy to
are
read
you-
the whole
are you-
sentence,
Just
yes.
point of clarification, Mr.
Sure.
Chair. Are you in the ordinance or are you in the policy?
It's the law enforcement use of equipment
It's
policy.
the policy.
So it reads, robots will only be used as a deadly force option when risk of life to members of the public or officers is imminent and officers cannot subdue the threat after using alternative force option or de-escalation tactics. So in other words, this word outweighs, which is very non-descriptive and very, I honestly don't even know what it means. This is more specific. This says that first, officers must try to subdue the threat using de-escalation and alternative force options. If that doesn't work, perhaps in the interim, they can bring a robot down. Again, I don't even agree with this. I'm just saying, at least it deals with the ambiguity of this word outweighs. They will be using these alternative force options that hopefully will work. Again, this is not going to gain my vote, but I think it is better than the status quo. But that's separate from Supervisor Peskin's amendment. And Supervisor Peskin, I'm wondering if you want to read your amendment, and then maybe we can take a vote on them both.
So just real quick, because we have 2 schools of thought, all somebody has to do is make a motion and we...
And Mr.
I'm
President,
happy to move that. Okay, go ahead, Supervisor Peskin.
I think actually we could be, the 2 amendments, and I'll read mine, are not mutually exclusive. They actually work together.
Exactly.
And I will reread the one I spoke to at the beginning of this item, which is only the chief, assistant chief of operations, or deputy chief of special operations may authorize the use of robots as a deadly force option. So that clause could follow the language suggested by Supervisor Ronan. That would satisfy this supervisor.
I agree to that.
So if you want
amendment.
to, I'm
So
happy
I will
to-
make a motion to amend. Is everybody clear about the 2 changes that?
I mean, I've
It'll be
heard
one-
them. I just don't know where they're inserted. I'm looking at the
They're,
policy.
they're not in the actual legislation.
No, I'm looking
They're-
at the policy.
It is on the first page.
Of the,
It is
the
on
law enforcement
excuse me,
policy.
It's on page 3 of
Great.
the policy.
Got it.
Halfway down the page, item 5, authorized use.
It just
First
currently says
paragraph,
provide
last
ground support and
sentence of the first
situational
paragraph.
awareness. That's it?
What's that?
That currently says provide ground support and situational awareness.
No.
No.
It says
We're in the law enforcement
We
policy.
are in the policy.
I'm in that too.
It's
Maybe I
5,
have the- maybe-
authorized use says at the last sentence of the first paragraph, and this is the contested Joe Rogan nationally publicized sentence, robots will only be used as a deadly force option when risk of loss of life, to members of the public or officers is imminent and outweighs any other force option available to the SFPD. And Supervisor Ronan has amended that sentence, and I have offered an additional sentence after that amended sentence.
And Supervisor Safai, did you find it?
Yeah, I'm finding it. I think
And by the way,
maybe I have the old one.
way of background, there were conversations in committee that the department was not adverse to as to the use of de-escalation and other efforts, being futile. So
who's making the motion?
I will make the motion to amend the legislation
The policy.
as stated by myself and Supervisor Peskin. Is that clear? We could read it again together if that is helpful.
That would be helpful, Supervisor, and you're amending the policy.
Policy, yeah.
The policy, yes.
Excuse me. Perfect. Okay. We are amending the policy.
Just real quick, Deputy Pearson.
Deputy City Attorney Ann Pearson. Actually, the amendment is to the legislation itself, and because the legislation approves the policy. So if you look at the last page of the legislation, it's on page 8, line 8. It right now says the Board of Supervisors hereby approves the use of equipment policy. And what the amendments together would do would say, subject to the following modifications. And the first one would describe the modification that's been proposed by Supervisor Ronan and then Supervisor Peskin.
Exactly. So it would read, I'll read it in the whole thing so this is less confusing. Robots will only be used as a deadly force option when risk of life to members of the public or officers is imminent, and officers cannot subdue the threat after using alternative force options or de-escalation tactics. Only the chief, assistant chief of operations, or deputy chief of special operations may authorize the use of robots as a deadly force option. That's the amendment.
Do we have a second? Seconded by Supervisor Peskin. Madam Clerk, motion made by Supervisor Ronan, seconded by Supervisor Peskin. Supervisor Mandelman.
Thank you, President Walton. I am curious to hear from the department what it sounds like the former Supervisor Peskin's amendment probably requires something you would already be doing, which is to have this being decided by folks high up in the food chain. I presume that's not a problem for you.
that was already run by the chief.
Just real quick, go ahead, Deputy Chief.
Yeah, that's not a problem. That makes good sense.
And the language requiring previous use of de-escalation techniques and what was the?
Alternative force options.
And alternative force options. Have you seen that before?
No, I've not seen
All right,
that.
so I'm not going to ask you unless you have
Well, I'm hearing it
thoughts
now.
about it. Yeah. Okay. Well, I probably would want to divide the question of the two amendments in terms of like when we're voting on them.
We have a first and a second, as is. Supervisor Safai?
You can divide the question by.
Oh, you can, yeah, true. Supervisor Safai?
I just want to ask the Assistant Chief, I heard you say this the first time you've heard that, but would more time allow you the opportunity to analyze and then get back and determine whether or not it's something that the department could support?
We are going to use, if we have the opportunity to use time, we are going to use time like as is our procedure. We're going
No,
to
I mean time to understand the amendments that are
Oh, I'm
proposed.
sorry.
Sorry, just to clarify.
time to, well, yeah, we would have to, if you're going to give this back to us to try to evaluate and assess whether or not this is operational,
Yes,
the amendment.
that's my question.
we-
Is it
we-
operational? Is something that the department could work with?
Is your question, is it something for us to work, would we approve this language or do we need to look at this language? I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
My question is specifically, you've heard this for the first time here today, pieces of it, and do you need time to look at it to determine if it's operational?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Ronan.
Assistant Chief Lazar, all this says is that before sending in a killer robot, or let me use less inflammatory language, before sending in a robot with a weapon that an officer can then push a button to deploy to use deadly force, that the officer or the SFPD would have to attempt any other tool in the arsenal, like any other use of force or de-escalation technique first. And I think that would be, it's almost necessarily, unless you walk around with robots with weapons all the time. I don't even see a situation where that wouldn't be possible, but at least it requires that thought process of trying to address the situation without the robot, whereas the word outweighs, I still don't understand what that means.
My proposal on behalf of the department would be to switch out the word attempt for evaluate. Evaluate. Because basically, Supervisor, the way that you've proposed it is we'd have to do step 1 and step 2 and step 3.
It's
and sometimes
not attempt, you would have to do it first.
we'd have to evaluate whether or not we can negotiate, whether or not we could send officers in there and get themselves in harm's way by engaging a suspect in a firefight. Like, we'd have to evaluate all our options, and then we'd have to evaluate whether or not the risk of harm and losing a life of a police officer is outweighed by, using the robot in lieu of an officer risking their life. Evaluate. If we take it step by step by step and we're locked to that, it's not practical as situations evolve. And of course, we can come up with 100 hypotheticals, but that's the way that I see it on behalf of the department. It gives us thought. It gives us an opportunity to be thoughtful.
That works.
Supervisor Dorsey.
Thank you, President Walton. I think I'm actually comfortable with the term outweighs because the existing use of force policy already provides that in any kind of an engagement, safeguarding human life and dignity, establishing communication, de-escalation is already part of any kind of a encounter with a dangerous subject. So I think it doesn't, my worry about making things duplicative and overly prescriptive is that it runs the risk of conflict. I think from my standpoint, based on where this is going to fit in the existing use of force policy, I think outweighs is right.
Thank you, Supervisor Dorsey. Supervisor Ronan.
I guess what I'm saying here with this amendment is that I understand that the police have had this technology for 11 years and haven't used this, but we have now unearthed this as a subject in a way that I think has actually been counterproductive in reality. There's that. There's also, and this is a bit in response to my colleagues, Supervisor Mandelman and Stephanie, in saying that this is just and Melgar, that this is hyperbole and just progressives, and that you've lost faith in the ACLU. We got an email from Catherine Scott, who lives in the Outer Sunset yesterday and who's worked in robotics all of her life, who holds a master's degree in CS with a focus in robotics from Columbia University, who says that the vast majority of professional and experts in her field do not think this is a good idea. She says currently no meaningful laws or best practices exist governing the use of weaponized robots. Last month, numerous robotic companies, including Boston Dynamics, Open Robotics, ClearPath Robotics, Unitree, and many others, signed a pledge to never weaponize the robots they built. This is the beginning of something that's going to become more and more common in society. And this supervisor believes, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic, I'm not, a leftist, I am a leftist progressive, but I'm also do everything that I do using reason and argument and clearly articulated positions that I don't appreciate being dismissed as, the ace, just attacking the police. I in no means want to attack the police with this. I want to protect our entire society. And I very much worry about the use of this technology. And I will repeat one last time that it's not the same to use force against a person through a mechanized object where you are not physically in the room and don't have a 360 view and can use your judgment that only humans have. This is a big deal. This is opening up a Pandora's box that could change our society in a significant way. Will it do it tomorrow? Probably not. Will it do it over time? Yes. And so I don't believe that this is something we should take lightly at all. And so what I am saying is this should not become the preferred way that we take down people that are committing crimes. That before we use a robot, which is not the same as a human being, that we should at least try to use the human beings and de-escalation and all the other numerous weapons at the disposal of the police and everything that the police do day in and day out first. That's important, that this should not become our fallback. And I think that is important to state in this policy. And so again, I would request that we just vote on this. Again, I'm going to vote for both of the amendments, but then I'm not going to vote for the underlying policy. So I'm just trying, in case this passes, I don't think we should I don't think we should ever weaponize robots to use against human beings. I think it's morally and practically the wrong way to go as a society. But if we're going to do that, we should at least make the policy better. So I would ask, we have made a motion and a second, the file has been divided, we should vote on the two amendments and move on with our lives.
For the question, Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, President Walton. In the spirit, insofar as there doesn't seem to be any desire or not much desire to send this back to committee, and in the spirit of getting this done, welcome to the Rules Committee, by the way, everybody. I, as a seconder, would encourage the maker to accept the word evaluate. And insofar as the maker is going to vote no anyway on the item as amended, and insofar as the maker is nodding her head in the negative, I will withdraw my second. And I would be prepared to make the exact same amendment without the attempted to insert the word evaluate in place thereof if there is not a seconder for the existing motion that says attempt to, and then we don't need to divide the question.
Mr. President, can I respond to Supervisor Peskin? Yes. Is that okay? The reason that I believe that completely eviscerates the point of the amendment, because obviously the police are always evaluating. The point that I'm making and what I'm worried about is that the police have never done this in 11 years. We've now unearthed this major discussion in San Francisco, and it's just the way we're going as a society. We're more mechanized. AI is becoming more, we're relying more on technology in the society. If we don't require them to use human beings and de-escalation first, my worry is that it will become the fallback of choice. And so we're saying very different things. That's very different amendment. To evaluate is the same as outweighs. It's like, and using what criteria? I'm saying there should be a very specific criteria, and that criteria should be use these other tools at your disposal first. And if those don't work, then you have this other tool at your disposal. I think it's a very different amendment, and that's why I can't just agree to it.
So if I may respond, Mr. President, and I say this fully acknowledging that I am not a cop nor trained in the law enforcement business, but I will say the following. One is, it takes time to deploy any of this equipment. Depending on what part of the city you're in, it can be quite some time. And so there is space and time in all of these situations. I can certainly envision, and we could certainly articulate scenarios where in that time things are getting worse, more people are being killed. The ability to, I mean, what's de-escalate mean? You can get on the LRAD and blast a message into the edifice at a high volume to say, would you like to come out and discuss this? And that is a form of de-escalation. But there may be times when you can't de-escalate because you can't communicate. Certainly, I mean, when we're talking about deployment of lethal force, somebody with a gun is going to show up a lot faster than somebody with a robot, and deploying the robot, I mean, these things are huge, heavy things that go into big trucks. So I kind of think, given what Supervisor Dorsey said, which is the initial statements in the policy relative to de-escalation and alternative uses being the overarching construct, the notion that the department can't just leap to that conclusion in these narrow cases. And I will say that the history is more than 11-year history. We've had robots that could remove bombs for more than 11 years. I do take very seriously, and it is true, the Philadelphia Police Department, in the case of the Move bombing, that was some of the most atrocious, illegal, despicable, immoral behavior by civil law enforcement in the history of this country, and there are other instances of it. I am pleased to say that even with excesses in the San Francisco Police Department, nothing has ever approached that, and it speaks to some level of command and control and maturity, goofy tweets by the SFPOA notwithstanding. So, I mean, and that does give me, I mean, insofar as past behavior is sometimes a predictor of future behavior, that does give me some comfort. But I think accommodating the department with the spirit of the two proposed amendments with evaluate would get this job done today. Alternatively, I suggested, although I know it was not music to my colleagues on the Rules Committee ears, just thrashing this out back in committee, but I can do either for what it's worth.
So Supervisor Peskin, do you still support the original motion or you withdraw?
I withdrew.
Thank you so much, Supervisor Peskin. Supervisor Preston.
Thank you, President Walton. And I think the discussion on some of these details is important because, there's been a lot of reference to the last 11 years and what hasn't been used. I want to be really clear. We have not had an explicit policy in the city and county of San Francisco authoring the use of robots to inflict deadly force on human beings in the city and county of San Francisco over the last 11 years. So I expect that it is far more likely we will see that power used when it is explicitly granted here. And I don't think we should take a lot of comfort in those 11 years. And let me just say this, and I say this reluctantly because I know we've been discussing this for a while. I don't want to get into a back and forth on the merits of a lot of what's been said. I do, having now been accused by the POA as well as by one or more colleagues here in this board of dishonesty with respect to the framing and the verbiage used to describe these robots. I'd like to address that because I think we're in a climate here where sometimes the best way of avoiding a reality seems to be to accuse the other side of making something up. So I'd like to know, and I would challenge folks who claim that my assertions here of this use of technology are somehow dishonestly portrayed, what that dishonesty is. Yeah, are people upset? Because I think some folks are upset that we're calling this what it is. So is killer robot an objectionable term? Would people prefer a robot that kills? Is that more acceptable? Because this policy, and let's just be clear what we're giving a green light to if we pass this. We are now, for the first time, saying in the city and county of San Francisco that robots can be used as a deadly force option. So I'd love to know what has been dishonestly portrayed in the discussion. And I, you know, look, I'm one of the first to point out when the media is hyperventilating over something or using hyperbolic language to get clicks and stuff. They're not here. They're really not. So let me know your preferred term for authorizing robots to use deadly force against the residents of the city and county of San Francisco, if you don't like the term that I've used for it in these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Preston. Supervisor Safai?
Again, I just wanted to ask the Assistant Chief to come back up if he could. I heard you state for the record, Assistant Chief Lazar, that your proposed language of attempts to evaluate, and based on what you've heard Supervisor Peskin articulate, is the department prepared then to support the guardrails as proposed with that language? Is that operational?
Yes, we're prepared to move forward with that policy. That is operational, that is acceptable for two reasons. One is we're going to be held accountable if something doesn't go right, whether or not we evaluated all our options. And second is because we already have Department General orders that require us to de-escalate. They require us to take the steps to try to resolve situations without using force. So it's already there. It's already been adopted by the commission. It's already been our practice. Department General Order 5.01, which can be Googled and brought up.
I guess, okay, thank you. I guess what I would say, and I hear what Supervisor Ronan was saying, and I respect that deeply because, you know, we have had many of those problems. To President Walton's point, I mean, normally in these situations where we're de-escalating, or there hasn't been de-escalation, when I think we were first elected to the board, Supervisor Ronan, it was then in some of our longer hearings that the Department of Public Health came in to talk with the chief to say for the first time they are implementing policies for de-escalation rather than some of the immediate reactions in terms of use of force. And so now we're 4 or 5 years in, and so there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there, and disproportionately, historically, that has been particularly communities of color that have been on the receiving end of that use of force. So I want to acknowledge your point, President Walton. And so I understand the spirit of what you're attempting to refer to, Supervisor Ronan, but I also understand, and that I hear the Assistant Chief say pretty clearly, that there needs to be the opportunity to evaluate. It's not a one step after the other, because in some circumstances, that is not, they're not able to do that. And they come in and they assess the situation to determine whether or not you can even move to a de-escalation. So I think that the amendment as proposed by Supervisor...
There's no amendment on the floor right at this point.
Supervisor, point of...
There's no amendment on the
Peskin
floor.
has not made an...
No.
The notion... Okay, sorry, President Walton. The notion suggested...
If he makes the motion, you could.
No, I'm waiting for...
It's not his turn, though.
Oh, okay.
And so when you move on, we can get there.
And I get, whoa, okay. We got everyone's blood pressure up today. Okay, I got it. The notion, oh, really? Chop to me. Okay. The notion suggested by Supervisor Peskin, I think, is a good balance because it talks about some guardrails. It talks about the attempt to evaluate, and it's something that I think will ultimately be operational and something that I could support if Supervisor Peskin were to articulate that, since he has the language in front of him. Thank you, President Walton.
Thank you, Supervisor Safai. Supervisor Chan.
Thank you, President Walton. We were so close, so close. So my curiosity and through the president to both Supervisor Ronan and Supervisor Peskin, because we were so close to our amendments that we could have come to an agreement today, at least for the amendments, not really for the policy. I know that no matter what, we're unlikely to reach an unanimous vote today. But in the spirits of trying to resolve this, because we already spent this much time, and because I do understand Supervisor Ronan's concern, because sometimes when we go into these policy making, we want to make sure that our intent and what we intend to do is clear to both the city departments and to this body, and therefore and to the general public, so that there will be no confusion, even if at times seems duplicative. So will it actually satisfy both Supervisor Ronan, Supervisor Peskin, and the police department, if this, even though I know it's duplicative, that we instead of outweighed, but just in the language that is in accordance to the General Order 5.01, which then clarifies as a reference point that it will actually mandate the department to de-escalate first before utilize this force. So I'm just laying it out there. I am not making a motion, but I am just for us to contemplate. Again, it's the reason why I also said maybe we should send this back to committee, so to allow discussion. But thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Chan. And just, this is why I love all 10 of you, because we are trying to get to some kind of common agreement, which is not going to happen. It is not going to happen. I think we're at the point, if you'll bear with me, where if Supervisor Peskin wants to make that motion and he gets a second, we move forward and just vote. And Supervisor Ronan, I know you're on the roster.
Thank you. I would just like an option to have, if I can get a second, to have an up or down vote on my amendment.
Seconded by Supervisor Melgar.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So we have a motion on the floor by Supervisor Ronan with the language to stay the same as in her motion.
Yeah, and just insofar as I don't actually have it written, can you just repeat it one more time?
And I'm sorry, I'm trying to get the written remedy. I'm sorry, you guys.
Okay.
It's just we were changing it as we were doing it, and so I don't have it printed. I'm trying to get a printed copy for you guys right now, and I apologize.
I have the language in front of me if it's helpful for me to.
Oh, I have it in front of me
Okay.
too, to read, not to pass out, which I feel.
I can do that too.
You have it to pass out?
No, I can distribute it electronically.
Oh,
I don't have-
fantastic. Yeah. I forget about, how ironic. Sorry, great point, colleagues. I'm sending it to you right now. That's hilarious. Sending this to you right now. It should be at the top of your inbox. And I will read it out loud for the public as my colleagues look at it in writing. So the sentence would read, robots will only be used as a deadly force option when risk of loss of life to members of the public or officers is imminent, and officers cannot subdue the threat after using alternative force options or de-escalation tactics.
And it was seconded by Supervisor Melgar. Madam Clerk, on the motion made by Supervisor Ronan, seconded by Supervisor Melgar.
On that amendment, Supervisor Stephanie. Stephanie, no. Supervisor Walton.
No.
Walton, no. Supervisor Chan. Chan, aye. Supervisor Dorsey. Dorsey, no. Supervisor Mandelman.
No.
Mandelman, no. Supervisor Marr.
Aye.
Marr, aye. Supervisor Melgar.
Aye.
Melgar, aye. Supervisor Peskin.
No.
Peskin, no. Supervisor Preston. Preston, aye. Supervisor Ronan.
Aye.
Ronan, aye. Supervisor Safai.
No.
Safai, no. There are 5 ayes and 6 noes with Supervisor Stephanie, Walton, Dorsey, Mandelman, Peskin, and Safai in the dissent.
Motion fails. Supervisor Peskin.
All right, let me try my lips at an alternative motion which is the same amendment on page 8, subsection C, starting at line 8, which would say the Board of Supervisors hereby approves the use of equipment policy with the following modifications. Section 1.A.5, parens unmanned remotely piloted powered ground vehicle, parens ground authorized use, is amended to replace the words outweighs any other force option available to SFPD with officers cannot subdue the threat after evaluating or using, so it's an or, alternative force options or de-escalation tactics, period. Only the Chief, Assistant Chief of Operations, or Deputy Chief of Special Operations may authorize the use of robots as a deadly force option, period.
Seconded by Supervisor, well, is that a second, Supervisor Safai?
Well, no, yes.
Seconded by Supervisor Safai.
But I also have a
Supervisor Safai.
Sorry, point of clarification. Did you work in the language attempts to evaluate?
I believe I did.
Okay, can you read it one more time, please?
Officers cannot subdue the threat after either evaluating or using. So it's, they either evaluate, come to the conclusion that they cannot.
I missed that. Thank you.
Or using alternative force options or de-escalation tactics, period. Only the Chief, Assistant Chief of Operations, or Deputy Chief of Special Operations may authorize the use of robots as a deadly force option, period.
Thank you.
Seconded by Supervisor Safai.
Yes.
1 second, Supervisor Ronan.
Deputy City Attorney Ann Pearson, we have not approved that language as to form, and I think we might want to have a minute just to look at it and maybe recommended some tweaks. I want to support this effort to reach a conclusion, but I'm not sure that language works. So if we could have just a little bit of time to look at it and evaluate.
Supervisor Ronan.
I'd like to divide the two amendments.
Got you. Do you got that, Madam Clerk?
Is the city attorney reviewing it first?
Well, I think we would need to approve as to form the new version that Supervisor Peskin has asked, but you can divide the question so that people can vote on the other amendment.
So we will go to item 29, and Deputy City Attorney Pearson will let me know when we're ready to come back to item 28.
And for the record, item number 28 is the ordinance regarding the funding, acquisition, and use of certain police department equipment.
Thank you. Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, President Walton. Colleagues, in consultation with the City Attorney's Office, I would offer the following modification to be set forth on page 8 of the ordinance at line 8 that would modify section 1.A.5 by replacing the words outweighs any other force option available to SFPD with the following. Officers cannot subdue the threat after using alternative force options or de-escalation tactics options, or conclude that they will not be able to subdue the threat after evaluating alternative force options and de-escalation tactics. Only the Chief, Assistant Chief of Operations, or Deputy Chief of Special Operations may authorize the use of robots as a deadly force option.
Thank you. Supervisor Safai, is your second still in order? Thank you. Supervisor Ronan.
I'd still like to divide the question.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, Supervisor Ronan wishes to divide the question.
So presumably into the first sentence and second sentence.
Correct.
All right, so for the first portion of the amendment offered by Supervisor Peskin, seconded by Safai, Supervisor Stephanie. Stephanie, aye. Supervisor Walton.
No.
Walton, no. Supervisor Chan. Chan, aye. Supervisor Dorsey. Dorsey, aye. Supervisor Mandelman. Mandelman, aye. Supervisor Marr. Marr, aye. Supervisor Melgar.
Aye.
Melgar, aye. Supervisor Peskin.
Aye.
Peskin, aye. Supervisor Preston. Preston, aye. Supervisor Ronan.
No.
Ronan, no. Supervisor Safai. Safai, aye. There are 9 ayes and 2 noes, with Supervisors Walton and Ronan in the dissent.
Thank you. By a vote of 9 to 2, the motion to amend passes. On the remaining portion,
On the second divided question, Supervisor Stephanie. Stephanie, aye. Supervisor Walton.
aye.
Walton, aye. Supervisor Chan. Chan, aye. Supervisor Dorsey. Dorsey, aye. Supervisor Mandelman. Mandelman, aye. Supervisor Marr. Marr, aye. Supervisor Melgar.
Aye.
Melgar, aye. Supervisor Peskin.
Aye.
Peskin, aye. Supervisor Preston.
Aye.
Preston, aye. Supervisor Ronan.
Aye.
Ronan, aye. Supervisor Safai. Safai, aye. There are 11 ayes.
Thank you. And on the remaining motion, it passes unanimously. Madam Clerk, now on the amended item number 28.
On the ordinance as amended, Supervisor Stephanie. Stephanie, aye. Supervisor Walton.
No.
Walton, no. Supervisor Chan. Chan, aye. Supervisor Dorsey. Dorsey, aye. Supervisor Mandelman.
Aye.
Mandelman, aye. Supervisor Marr. Marr, aye. Supervisor Melgar. Melgar, aye. Supervisor Peskin.
Aye.
Peskin, aye. Supervisor Preston.
No.
Preston, no. Supervisor Ronan.
No.
Ronan, no. Supervisor Safai. Safai, aye. There are 8 ayes and 3 noes, with Supervisors Walton, Preston, and Ronan in the dissent.
Thank you. The amended item number 28 passes by a vote of 8 to 3 on first reading.